The soil of an American city is rarely as silent as it appears. Beneath the paved walkways of our public parks, tucked between the roots of centuries-old oaks and the iron pipes of forgotten water mains, lies a stratigraphic record of who we used to be. Usually what we find is predictable: colonial refuse, rusted tools, perhaps the occasional copper coin. But in the spring of 2014, during a routine drainage renovation in Philadelphia's Fairmount Park, a backhoe operator uncovered something that defied the typical archaeology of the urban landscape. Neatly arranged in a cedar wood crate, buried 6 feet beneath a secluded grove, were hundreds of small, hand-blown glass vials. They were sealed with wax, their contents a shimmering, amber-colored fluid that had remained undisturbed for nearly a century. As the investigation expanded, it became clear this wasn't an isolated cache. Similar deposits were located in public squares in Baltimore, Boston, and New York. By the time the survey was complete, historians realized that in late 1918, approximately 5,000 of these vials had been systematically interred across the parks of the Northeast. There were no markers, no commemorative plaques, no mention in the public records of the time. Records suggest that the operation was carried out with surgical precision during the height of the most catastrophic pandemic in human history. But that wasn't the strangest part. To understand why a nation would bury 5,000 glass containers in its leisure spaces, we have to look at the world of 1918. It was a year defined by the dual horrors of the Great War and the Spanish flu. The social fabric was fraying. In cities like Philadelphia, the death rate was so high that horse-drawn carts patrolled the streets, with drivers calling for the residents to bring out their dead. The medical community was in a state of total collapse. Doctors were dying alongside their patients, and the scientific understanding of viruses was still in its infancy. It was an era of desperation, where the line between cutting-edge medicine and occult folklore often blurred. Public parks, usually seen as the lungs of the city, had been transformed into makeshift morgues or tent hospitals. It is within this atmosphere of trauma and transition that the vial burials took place. The first signs that these burials were part of a coordinated effort appeared in the fragmented logs of the municipal horticultural departments. In November 1918, just as the armistice was being signed in Europe, a series of work orders was issued for subsurface soil stabilization. The orders were unusually specific, demanding that the work be done between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning by teams of 3 men, none of whom were to be regular city employees. One surviving ledger from Philadelphia mentions a contracted party consisting of members from the United States Army Medical Corps and a private laboratory whose name has been redacted in the surviving carbon copies. Some historians believe these teams were tasked with a mission of national security, hidden under the guise of park maintenance. What they were planting, however, was not intended to grow. As the first vials were recovered and sent to modern forensic laboratories, the mystery deepened. The glass itself was of high quality, typical of the surgical supply houses of the early 20th century. The wax seals were intact, suggesting that whatever was inside was meant to be preserved indefinitely, shielded from the oxygen and bacteria of the soil. When researchers at a specialized facility in Maryland finally breached the seals of the Fairmount cache, they expected to find a serum, a vaccine, or perhaps a concentrated form of the influenza virus itself. Instead, the chemical analysis revealed a complex cocktail of botanical extracts, heavy metals, and a stabilized form of an unknown protein. There is no clear consensus on what this mixture was intended to do. Some toxicologists noted the presence of belladonna and mercury standard, if dangerous, ingredients in 1918 medicine, but the way they were suspended in the fluid suggested a level of pharmacological sophistication that was decades ahead of its time. The discovery of the vials triggered a frantic search through the National Archives. Researchers were looking for a code name, a project title, anything that could explain the scale of the interment. They found a series of telegrams sent in October 1918 from the Surgeon General's office to various municipal health boards. The messages were brief, often consisting of a single sentence: "The 5,000 units are ready for placement." The telegrams were marked with a classification that didn't technically exist at the time, a precursor to the top-secret designations of the Cold War. It became apparent that the burial of the vials wasn't a local reaction to the pandemic, but a federal mandate. But that wasn't the strangest part. What didn't add up was the geography of the burials. If these vials contained a medicine or a vaccine meant for emergency use, They would have been stored in hospitals or military armories, not buried 6 feet underground in public groves. A mapping of the 5,000 vials revealed a pattern that was mathematically perfect. They weren't clustered near the most infected neighborhoods. Instead, they were placed in a geometric grid that seemed to correlate with the city's magnetic ley lines and the flow of the underground water tables. In New York Central Park, a cache was found exactly 100 yards from every major entrance. In Boston Common, they were buried in a perfect circle around the central fountain. This suggested that the vials weren't meant to be ingested or injected. They were meant to influence the environment itself. The personal stories of the few witnesses who caught a glimpse of the burial teams add a layer of chilling detail to the narrative. In a letter written by a night watchman in 1919, he described seeing a group of men in long, leather coats standing over a trench in the park. He noted that they didn't use shovels. They used a mechanical auger that made almost no sound. He described how they handled the wooden crates with a reverence usually reserved for the host in a cathedral. When he approached them, he was met by an officer who showed him a badge he didn't recognize and told him that what he was seeing was the insurance of the future. The watchman wrote that he couldn't stop thinking about the amber fluid in the vials, how it seemed to catch the moonlight even through the thick glass. He died of a sudden, unexplained respiratory failure only months after writing the letter. What happened next remains unclear, as the project, if it can be called, that seems to have been terminated as abruptly as it began. By January 1919, the telegrams stopped. The men in leather coats were never seen again. The 5,000 vials remained in the earth, silent witnesses to a century of progress, war, and change. It wasn't until the construction boom of the 21st century that these glass phantoms began to reappear, forcing us to confront a chapter of 1918 that doesn't appear in any textbook. Was it a desperate attempt at a spiritual or energetic cure for a pandemic that science couldn't stop? Or was it something else, a biological experiment that required a century of incubation? As the modern forensic teams continued their work, they realized that the vials they had found were not all the same. While the Fairmount vials contained the amber fluid, a cache discovered in a park in Washington, D.C., contained something else entirely. These vials were filled with a dark, granular sand that, when viewed under a microscope, appeared to be composed of crushed gemstones and charred bone. The pattern of the burials was beginning to look less like a medical grid and more like a massive, multi-city ritual. The escalation of the mystery was reached when a researcher found a discarded memo in the basement of the Smithsonian dated December 1918. It was a list of coordinates, and next to each one was a single word: activated. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. The word activated in the Smithsonian memo suggests a deliberate trigger, a transition from a passive state of burial to an active state of function. For the modern investigators of the Fairmount and Boston caches, this raised a disturbing question. How does a sealed glass vial, buried 6 feet deep, become active? Some historians believe the answer lies in the specific timing of the burials. October and November of 1918 weren't just the peak of the influenza pandemic. They were also months of intense solar activity and atmospheric fluctuations. In an era when the secrets of the ionosphere were just being teased out by pioneers like Marconi and Tesla, the idea of wireless influence was the frontier of science. The vials, with their suspension of heavy metals and strange proteins, may have been designed as biological or chemical transducers objects meant to react to a specific frequency or atmospheric charge. In the late spring of 2016, a second major discovery occurred, this time on the grounds of the Boston Common. During the installation of a new irrigation system near the Park Street station, workers found another crate. But unlike the Fairmount find, these vials were accompanied by a series of thin, lead plates, etched with what appeared to be topographical maps of the city's coastline. When the plates were cleaned and analyzed, researchers found they were not maps of the streets, but maps of the city's acoustic corridors, the specific paths that wind and sound take through the urban canyons. Records suggest that the placement of the vials in Boston was designed to intersect with these corridors. It was as if the 5,000 vials were part of a giant, invisible instrument, and the city itself was the resonator. The chemical analysis of the Boston vials added another layer to the enigma. While the amber fluid in Philadelphia contained mercury and belladonna, the Boston vials contained a high concentration of silver nitrate and what modern sequencing identified as a primitive, synthetic enzyme. This was a direct contradiction to the medical capabilities of 1918. Synthetic enzymes are a product of late 20th century biochemistry. To find them in a wax-sealed vial from the end of the Great War is a chronological impossibility that has left the scientific community at a loss. Some believe these enzymes were the result of a natural mutation that occurred within the vials over a century of burial, while others suggest that the 1,918 teams were utilizing a form of forgotten science that didn't survive the post-war era. And that's when things began to shift. As the news of the discoveries spread, a retired archivist from the Rockefeller Institute came forward with a collection of private papers belonging to a Dr. Harrison Vance, a researcher who had worked briefly for the government's Chemical Warfare Service in 1918. Vance's letters to his wife describe a project he called the Quiet Grove. He wrote of a solution for the madness of the air, suggesting that the pandemic wasn't being spread just by human contact, but by a vibration in the atmosphere that the vials were meant to neutralize. Vance was a proponent of the now discredited theory of miasma, but with a modern electromagnetic twist. He believed that the Great War's massive artillery barrages had torn the air, allowing the influenza to take hold. The 5,000 vials were, in his view, a suture for the world's atmosphere. But Dr. Vance's letters also contained a warning. He wrote that the activation of the vials would require a specific event to occur, something that would catalyze the proteins and the metals. He didn't specify what that event was, but he noted that once the process began, it couldn't be stopped. "We are planting the seeds of a new peace," he wrote, "but the harvest may be more than we can endure." Records suggest that shortly after writing this, Vance was transferred to a remote facility in the New Mexico desert, and his name was purged from the Rockefeller Institute's payroll. There is no clear consensus on his fate, but his letters provide the only known contemporary link to the Quiet Grove project. The psychological state of the public in 1918 must be factored into any interpretation of these events. The world was in the grip of a collective trauma. People were willing to try anything, no matter how experimental or bizarre, to stop the dying. In some cities, residents were ordered to wear masks made of gauze that offered no real protection. In others, they were told to gargle with salt water or avoid the night air. The burial of 5,000 vials in public parks would have been seen by those few in the know as a high-tech scientific ritual, a way for the state to exert control over a situation that was fundamentally uncontrollable. But the physical evidence suggests that this wasn't just a morale-boosting exercise. The complexity of the vials and the precision of the grid point to a functional purpose. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In 2018, a geophysicist using ground-penetrating radar in Baltimore's Patterson Park found a void beneath one of the vial caches. When the void was excavated, it was found to be a small, brick-lined chamber containing a primitive radio transmitter and a series of copper coils. The transmitter was powered by a lead-acid battery that had long since leaked into the soil. The frequency of the device was tuned to a very specific, low-frequency hum, a pitch that matches the resonant frequency of the human respiratory system. This discovery suggested that the vials weren't just sitting in the soil, they were being pulsed by these underground stations. The grid of 5,000 vials was, in effect, a massive, city-wide antenna. This revelation shifted the investigation from medicine to physics. Was the 1,918 government attempting to use sonic therapy on a mass scale to treat the pandemic, or was the project a test for something else, a way to influence the behavior of a panicked population? In the aftermath of the Great War, the fear of civil unrest was palpable. The burial of the vials coincided with the Red Scare and a wave of labor strikes across the Northeast. Some historians believe the Quiet Grove project was a dual-use technology, a potential cure for the flu and a tool for social stabilization. By creating a localized, low-frequency field in the public parks, the government may have been trying to induce a state of calm in the citizens. But that wasn't the strangest part. When modern researchers attempted to recreate the Quiet Grove field in a controlled environment using a replica of the Baltimore transmitter and the amber fluid from the Fairmount vials, they observed a phenomenon that defied explanation. The fluid didn't just vibrate. It began to glow with a soft, bioluminescent light that pulsed in sync with the radio frequency. More importantly, the researchers reported that the air around the vials became heavy and unnaturally still, mirroring the descriptions found in the Night Watchman's 1,919 letter. The fluid seemed to be absorbing the static electricity from the air, creating a localized vacuum of energy. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, the vial burials of 1,000 918 started to look like a desperate, brilliant, and perhaps terrifying attempt to manipulate the very fabric of reality during a time of crisis. The 5,000 glass vials were the components of a machine that turned the Northeast's parks into a series of massive, biological filters. But as the project reached its activated phase in late 1918, something went wrong. The flu pandemic began to recede, but the Quiet Grove project didn't just end, it was erased. The underground stations were abandoned, the men in leather coats vanished, and the vials were left to be swallowed by the earth. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In 2021, a new survey of the Fairmount Park site revealed that the soil surrounding the burial crates was sterile. No worms, no bacteria, no root systems had touched the cedarwood in over 100 years. It was as if the vials had created a permanent exclusion zone in the earth, a pocket of time that had remained frozen since 1918. The phenomenon of the sterile soil, the exclusion zone around the Fairmount cache, challenges our fundamental understanding of biological decay. In a typical subterranean environment, wood and wax are subject to a relentless assault by fungi and moisture. Yet, the 1,918 cedar crates appeared as though they had been interred only yesterday. Modern soil scientists, using carbon dating and microbial analysis, have confirmed that the earth within a 12-inch radius of the vials has been effectively stilled. There is no cellular respiration, no nitrogen cycle. It is as if the amber fluid has projected a field of preservation into the surrounding matter, a biological pause button pressed a century ago. Some historians believe this was the true intent of the Quiet Grove project, not just to cure a virus, but to create a permanent, stabilized environment where life and death could be held in stasis. But that wasn't the strangest part. As the 2020s began, the investigative focus shifted from the chemistry of the vials to the people who vanished in their wake. A search of the 1,920 census records for the families of the men in leather coats, those identified in the Watchman's letter, revealed a startling pattern. In almost every case, the individuals associated with the Quiet Grove project were listed as deceased or missing within 2 years of the armistice. Their death certificates, when they existed, frequently cited exhaustion of the nervous system or spontaneous respiratory arrest. It was as if the activation of the vials had exacted a heavy toll on those who placed them. There is no clear consensus on whether this was due to exposure to the chemical cocktail or a result of the localized electromagnetic fields generated by the underground transmitters. What is clear, however, is that by 1922, every living link to the 5,000 vials had been severed. This total erasure extends to the landscape itself. In the mid-1920s, many of the parks that housed the caches underwent massive beautification projects. Millions of tons of new topsoil were brought in, and the original groves where the vials were buried were covered by tennis courts, statues, or ornamental gardens. Records suggest that these renovations were funded by a series of anonymous grants routed through the same shell companies that had appeared in the 1918 municipal ledgers. For decades, the vial burials remained a secret hidden beneath the leisure of the American public. And that's when a modern re-examination changed the narrative entirely. In 2022, a team of geneticists at a university in Pennsylvania was granted permission to run a full genomic sequence on the impossible synthetic enzymes found in the Boston Common vials. What they found was a protein structure that bore a 98% similarity to a sequence patented in 2014, nearly a century after the vials were buried. The discovery has sent shockwaves through the historical community. Some believe it suggests a case of extreme scientific convergence, where 1,918 researchers independently arrived at a solution that would take another 100 years for modern science to rediscover. Others, more cautiously, suggest that the vials were part of a temporal insurance policy, a set of biological markers placed in the earth to be found only when our technology was advanced enough to understand them. The question of why remains the most elusive layer of the mystery. If the project was a success, why was it hidden? If it was a failure, why was it so meticulously preserved? Some historians believe that the 1,918 pandemic was seen as a biological reset for the human race, and the 5,000 vials were a failsafe intended to protect a specific genetic or environmental heritage in the event of a total societal collapse. Others point to the emerging field of bioweathering, suggesting that the government was trying to find a way to use the atmosphere itself as a medium for mass immunization. But the presence of the radio transmitters and the heavy metals suggests a project that was much more aggressive than simple medicine. As we walk through the parks of Philadelphia, Boston, and New York today, we are walking over a grid that is still largely intact. Of the estimated 5,000 vials buried in 1918, fewer than 800 have been recovered. The remaining 4,000 plus are still out there, tucked beneath the grass where children play and joggers run. They remain activated, if the geophysicists are correct, still pulsing their low-frequency hum into the urban soil. The Quiet Grove is not a historical event. It is a permanent installation, a silent machine that has been running for 100 years without a single person noticing the vibration. The final layer of evidence surfaced only recently, in a series of digital files recovered from a defunct municipal server in Baltimore. The files contained a set of expected result projections dated from 1918, outlining a plan for the re-emergence of the project's effects in the early 21st century. The document suggests that the Quiet Grove was never meant to end the 1918 pandemic. It was meant to prepare the soil and the population for a secondary activation that would occur 100 years later. There is no clear consensus on what this second activation entails, but the sterilization of the soil and the impossible enzymes suggest a transformation that we are only just beginning to witness. What happened next remains unclear, as the modern investigation has slowed to a crawl. The sites of the remaining burials have been declared environmentally sensitive by federal authorities, and further excavations have been strictly prohibited. The amber fluid and the synthetic proteins remain in secure labs, their secrets guarded by a new generation of men in leather coats, this time wearing lab coats and holding security clearances. The Quiet Grove has returned to the shadows, but the mystery it represents continues to hum beneath our feet. In the end, the story of the 5,000 vials is a story about the lengths to which a society will go when faced with an existential threat. It is a story of science and ritual, of a government that chose to bury its secrets in the very places we go to find peace. The parks of our cities are the lungs of our civilization, but the 1,918 burials suggest they are also its archives keepers of a history that was never meant to be read. As we look at the grainy, black and white imagery of the 1,918 workers and the modern, high-resolution scans of the glass vials, we are left with a profound sense of the unknown. The soil of America is not silent. It is vibrating with the echoes of a century-old plan that no one can explain, a machine that was built in the dark and buried in the light. Whether the harvest doctor Vance spoke of is already upon us, or whether it is still waiting for the right frequency to emerge, remains a question for the next 100 years. Until then, the glass vials stay in the earth, sealed with wax, waiting for the world to catch up to the science of 1,918. The mystery remains open. The grid remains active. And as the sun sets over Fairmount Park, the amber fluid in the vials beneath the trees catches a light that shouldn't be there, a soft, pulsing glow from a century that refuses to stay buried.